In January 2021, on the morning of the 7th, a gate opened in a 30-hectare enclosure on a remote island in the Iberá wetlands of northeast Argentina, and a female jaguar named Mariua walked through it with 2 cubs at her side. She crossed the threshold into a 1.7 million acre wilderness that had not held a wild jaguar in 70 years. A GPS collar around her neck began transmitting her position back to a research station where Sebastian Di Martino, the conservation director of Fundación Rewilding Argentina, watched the data come in. He had been working toward this moment for more than a decade. What Mariua and the jaguars that followed her did to the marshes around them in the 4 years that followed forced a continent of conservationists to reconsider what an apex predator can do to a wetland that has forgotten what one looks like. Before you can understand what 15 jaguars did to the Iberá marshes, you need to understand what the marshes had become and why the people who lived alongside them had stopped expecting the cats to ever come back. The Iberá wetlands cover roughly 1.3 million hectares in the Corrientes province of northeast Argentina, making them one of the largest freshwater wetland systems in the world, second only to Brazil's Pantanal. For most of the 20th century, the region was a working landscape. Cattle ranches sprawled across the higher ground. Pine and eucalyptus monocultures replaced native grasslands. Hunters worked the marshes for hides, for meat, and for sport. The jaguar, the largest cat in the Americas, and the apex predator of South American wetlands, was the most valuable target of all. By the 1950s, the last jaguar had been killed in Corrientes province. The species that had shaped Iberá's food web for tens of thousands of years was gone. And without it, something began to happen to the wetland that nobody at the time fully understood. The capybara is a large semi-aquatic rodent. In Iberá, an adult animal can weigh more than 60 kilograms. It is the world's largest rodent, and it was once one of the jaguar's primary prey species. Without jaguars, capybara numbers across the wetland rose to densities that ecologists working in the region described as unusual even by South American standards. Regional surveys recorded approximately 15 capybaras per square kilometer in Iberá, compared to roughly 7 per square kilometer in the Pantanal, where jaguars still hunted them. Marsh deer populations climbed. The pressure on the wetlands vegetation increased. The dense aquatic plant communities that had supported the wetlands' biodiversity began to thin in the places where grazers concentrated most heavily. The wetland did not look broken from a distance. It looked, in fact, abundant. Capybaras everywhere, caimans in the channels, birds in the reed beds. But the structure that had held the system in balance for thousands of years, the regulating pressure of an apex predator, had been removed. What remained was a wetland producing biomass without the constraint that had once shaped it. In 1997, an American conservation philanthropist named Douglas Tompkins, co-founder of the North Face clothing company, began buying ranches in Corrientes province. His goal, and the goal of his wife Christine Tompkins, who continued the work after his death in 2015, was to consolidate roughly 150,000 hectares of degraded ranch and farmland into a single restored landscape that could be donated to the Argentine government as a national park. The land acquisition was the first step. The second was harder. The Tompkins organization, working with the Argentine nonprofit that would eventually become Fundación Rewilding Argentina, began the slow process of reintroducing the species that had disappeared from Iberá over the previous century. Giant anteaters came first in 2007. Pampas deer followed. Collared peccaries, bare-faced curassows, red and green macaws, each species reintroduced from breeding stocks sourced through international partnerships, each release monitored and documented. But the program had always been pointed at one species in particular. Without the jaguar, the food web that the other reintroductions were rebuilding would remain incomplete. A wetland with all of its grazers and seed dispersers and small predators returned. But no apex carnivore is not a restored wetland. It is a wetland with a missing piece at the top. In 2012, construction began on the Jaguar Reintroduction Center on San Alonso Island, a remote site within the Iberá system surrounded by water and accessible only by boat. The facility included large pre-release enclosures designed to let captive jaguars learn to hunt wild prey before being released. Animals were sourced from zoos, from breeding centers, and from rehabilitation programs in Brazil, including jaguars that had been orphaned as cubs or rescued from conflict situations. The first cub was born at the center in 2018. Her name was Arami. She was the foundation of what came next. Sebastian Di Martino described the program's logic in terms that drew on a comparison conservation biologists had been making for 2 decades. Just as the return of gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 had recalibrated whole ecosystems that had fallen out of balance, he said, jaguars could restore these wetlands. The Yellowstone parallel was not just rhetorical, it was structural. Both ecosystems had lost their apex predator. Both had developed the kind of vegetation pressure and prey overabundance that follows when top-down control is removed. And both faced the same question. Would the system respond to the predator's return the way the science predicted? In Argentina, that question had been unanswered for 70 years. On January 7, 2021, Mariua, a rehabilitated wild jaguar from Brazil, walked through the gate of her enclosure with her cubs, Karai and Poron. They were the first jaguars to set paws in the wild in Iberá since the 1950s. More releases followed across the next 4 years. Female jaguars first, because their territories are smaller and they disperse less, anchoring the new population to a specific area. Males after, drawn by females and prey. By 2024, approximately 15 jaguars had been released across the system, and the wild-born cubs that resulted from successful breeding had pushed the free-living population to around 25 animals. The jaguars did not need instructions. They began hunting capybaras immediately. Dr. Carlos D'Angelo, an ecologist working with the project, led the team that documented what came next. Using a combination of GPS collar data, camera traps, prey kill site investigations, and GIS-based mapping software updated approximately every 20 days, his team built one of the most detailed real-time records of an apex predator reintegrating into a wetland food web that has ever been assembled in South America. The first changes were behavioral. Capybaras in Iberá had spent 70 years living in a landscape without a primary predator. Their group sizes, their use of cover, their vigilance behaviors had all relaxed during the decades when nothing was actively hunting them. Within months of the first jaguar releases, observational data showed measurable shifts in capybara behavior in the areas where jaguars had established territories. The animals were spending more time in larger groups. They were spending more time near water and dense cover. They were vigilant in ways that capybaras in the predator-free decades had not needed to be. The behavioral cascade extended beyond capybaras. Marsh deer in the affected areas changed their movement patterns. Their grazing concentrated in different micro-habitats than it had before the jaguars arrived. The vegetation in the patches where grazers had previously concentrated began to recover. Aquatic plant communities thickened in margins where they had thinned. The same trophic cascade that had reshaped Yellowstone's riparian zones after the wolves returned was beginning to express itself in the marshes of northeast Argentina, with a different predator and different prey, but the same fundamental logic. The jaguars had not been asked to reshape the wetlands' vegetation. They had done it as a consequence of hunting. One puzzle nagged at the researchers from the beginning, and it shaped the project's relationship with the surrounding communities. The land around Iberá National Park is cattle country. Jaguars are large predators capable of killing cattle. Every other jaguar reintroduction effort in Latin America had faced the same problem. Ranchers shoot the cats that kill their livestock. Without the cooperation of the people who own the land that the cats inevitably wander onto, no reintroduction program can succeed for more than a generation. Rewilding Argentina's response was not a fence. It was an economic strategy. The organization worked with provincial government partners to transition surrounding communities from cattle ranching toward nature-based tourism. The logic was direct. A live jaguar in Iberá, visible to tourists, generated more long-term revenue for the surrounding economy than a dead jaguar protecting a cattle herd ever could. The town of Colonia Carlos Pellegrini, sitting on the edge of the wetland, transformed itself across 2 decades from a marginal ranching settlement into one of Argentina's premier ecotourism destinations. Lodges, guided boat tours, wildlife photography expeditions, and a growing infrastructure of nature-focused services replaced the cattle-based economy that had dominated the region for a century. By 2024, Iberá had been recognized by Time magazine as one of the world's greatest places of the year. The provincial reserve and national park together protected more than 1.3 million hectares. Tourism revenue flowed back into the communities surrounding the park. The jaguars, increasingly visible to visitors as the population grew, became the economic anchor of a region that had once viewed them as vermin. The species that had been hunted out of Iberá because it was worth more dead than alive had returned because it was now worth more alive than dead. The implications moved beyond Iberá. In March 2025, Rewilding Argentina conducted the first translocation of a wild-born jaguar from Iberá to El Impenetrable National Park in the Gran Chaco region, more than 700 kilometers to the northwest. The Gran Chaco population had been reduced to a handful of isolated males. Without females, the population faced functional extinction within a single generation. The Iberá program, by producing wild-born jaguars in numbers sufficient to support translocation, had become a source population for the restoration of the species across northern Argentina. Di Martino described what the model meant in terms that reframed the conservation conversation across South America. Traditional conservation, he said, had been based on the principle of protecting what remained without active intervention. That approach had failed for jaguars across most of their historic range. Active rewilding, the deliberate return of locally extinct species to ecosystems that had been functioning without them for decades, was a different framework, and the Iberá data showed it could work. By 2025, the estimated total wild jaguar population of Argentina was 200 to 250 animals fragmented across northern provinces. The 25 free-living jaguars in Iberá represented roughly 10% of the country's total. They had been produced in 15 years by a program that had not existed before 2012. There is a marsh in the Iberá wetlands above the town of Colonia Carlos Pellegrini, where a guide takes visitors out in a flat-bottomed boat at dawn. The water is still. Howler monkeys call from forested islands. Capybaras sit in family groups at the water's edge, watchful in a way that the capybaras of the 1990s never were. Caimans drift in the channels. Marsh deer move through the tall grass in the distance. Somewhere on the higher ground, beyond the visible margin of the marsh, there is a jaguar. The guide may not see her. Most visitors will not see her. But the GPS collar around her neck transmits her position back to a research station on San Alonso Island, where Sebastian DiMartino and his team can watch her move across the territory that her species has not occupied in 70 years. 15 jaguars released across 4 years, 25 free living animals by 2024, a wetland whose food web is reorganizing itself around the predator that had been missing from it for 3 generations, a regional economy that has transitioned from cattle ranching to nature-based tourism, a source population producing animals for translocation to a second national park 700 kilometers away. That is not a coincidence. That is what an apex predator does when it is allowed back into a landscape that evolved with it, and what the landscape does when the predator is given the space to be part of it again. But Argentina is not the only country where a single keystone species pulled back from extinction has rewritten the ecological logic of an entire region. In our next video, we travel to Mozambique, where a national park that lost 95% of its large mammals during a 15-year civil war became the site of one of the most ambitious carnivore reintroductions in African history, and where a small pack of animals released in 2018 changed the way conservationists think about post-conflict ecosystems forever. If you thought 15 jaguars rewriting a wetland was unexpected, wait until you see what 14 wild dogs did to a park that had been emptied by war. You will not look at conservation the same way again.